fantastic to be here and to be able to share with you this morning, and it's a great topic. It kind of reminds me of my wife, the biologist, teaches biology at Georgetown. She teaches a gen ed biology course called Shall the Microbes Inherit the Earth? Of course, the answer is they've already inherited the Earth. The microbes are in control. So designing for difficulty, recentering the university around the high-impact curriculum. I want to kind of share with you today a lot of things that I've been thinking about in the last couple of years about where could higher education go, the kind of volatile landscape around higher education, and how are we possibly positioned to think about the future. I spend a lot of my time thinking about the future. This is unfortunate. I spent a lot of my time thinking about the future at Georgetown. As Vice Provost for Education, one of my main responsibilities is leading this initiative that we call Designing the Futures of the University. And I spent a lot of my time in this little red townhouse, which we call the Red House. Red. That's our little curriculum incubator. That's where we work with faculty who are trying to design new ways to imagine a Georgetown education. And for about the last year, basically invited the campus, the release of a document, and then incubating various programs to ask our faculty to think about what would you like to do that you can't do now because of the way that we do our business. Think beyond the 15-week semester, think outside the 9-month calendar, think outside the 3-credit course, the credit hour even. Just if you could do more of what you want to do to improve learning, reshape education, what is it that you'd like to do? What could we possibly imagine beyond the constraints of our current model? So we already do a tremendous amount around pedagogical innovation. I founded and directed a Center for Teaching, Learning, and Technology for 13 years before I was demoted to become Vice Provost for Education. So we're doing lots of work there, but this was taking that up a notch, as Chef Emerald would say, taking that up a notch and saying actually, what could we imagine now to build on all that, to create a bigger space to imagine how to. So that's what goes on in this red house, and we have that over our fireplace to remind us that this is possible, that we don't need necessarily disruptors from outside the university to help us figure out how to reinvent university. So I think a lot about the future. I actually teach a course, which I'll mention again just very briefly. I'm now teaching it for the 3rd time, called The Future of the University as a Design Problem. It's an undergraduate course. I co-teach it with an architect, in which the students in teams try to design the university for the year 2020. So I've been thinking about that number, or a number like that, a lot for the last few years. It's funny how futuristic that date looks when you look at it like that. And yet that's only 16 years from now, right? When you think about the students who we just enrolled last September, they're the class of 2018 years. I mean, they'll be, just getting going in their careers by 20. So it isn't that far away, and I think it's useful to kind of think about what that many years means ago. So if you go back 20 years, this is a direct quote, I'll explain in a moment. If you go back just 20 years, okay, so 1994, this quote, a lot of people might have said this in 1994, but this is particularly quoting the man who was Buddy Corrales, who was a philosopher, who was the head of the Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education, which was the major funding arm of the U.S. Department of Education. It has been mostly since that time. And he apparently said that when they got to a proposal that I had written for what was known as the American Studies Crossroads Project, and it was to build a global virtual community for the international community of people who did American studies. And it was funded by FIPSI, and I always actually had known that it was the first ever web-based project that was ever funded by FIPSI, maybe by the Department of Ed. But I didn't know until about 6 months ago when my program officer, who's now retired, came up to me, told me that that's what buddies said when they got to proposal. But think about that, because we were all kind of there. I mean, I even remember writing that proposal in 1993, asking friends, should we do this on the web or Gopher? Right? Good guess, right? Good thing we didn't go. We're all in on Gopher. That is a joke that anybody under like 43 doesn't get, I guess. But you have kids, you know that look. So just think about like how in 20 years we got from what the hell, sorry, this presentation, we got from what the hell to where we are now, right? So just 20 years. And you think about even the second half of that 20 years. So 2004 is the year of Google's IP. 2004 is the year that Facebook is founded. YouTube isn't even created until 2005. So think about that. 10 years, Google, YouTube, Facebook. Think about the force of those three things on the shape of our lives in just 10 years, just half of that 20 years from what the hell now. So when you look forward and think about a number like 2030, it's only 16 years away, not so long. And things are going to keep going at a faster pace. So there's a lot of talk about disruption, and I'm going to use that word a few times today, though it's contestable in various ways. But the reason we called our initiative at Georgetown Designing the Futures of the University is we were trying to actually flip the discourse around disruption into a discourse of design. So when you're obsessed with disruption, then what you're worried about is how is it that despite what's going on around you, you can stay what you are. But if you're asking a design question, then you're asking what is it we want to become? What is the university we want to be? What is the university we should be? What kind of education are we aiming for? So to me, the most interesting design question of this moment is if we were designing the university at this moment in history, based on everything we value, but everything that's also possible in the environment in which we're currently living, what would that look like? Or a couple of variations on it. So what kind of education do we most need right now? What kind of education is only possible? That's really different than to ask, how can we use technology to be more efficient? How can we run more people through colleges faster? How can we speed time to degree? It's a really different set of questions to ask. So when we launch the initiative, you're going to ask that kind of question, what kind of education is only possible now? You'd want to ask a couple of things. What is it that we believe we are, and who we are, and what we do best, possibly what we do uniquely, which is a big part of for us to do. And then you want to ask, what is it we could do? So, but when we kicked off the initiative, our president, Jack Joya, gave a wonderful talk, which is online, both written and the video, if you're interested, in which he basically said, this is where we start, right? Universities do three things. All universities, especially American universities, three things. We engage in the formation of men and women. Georgetown is a Jesuit and Catholic institution, so formation is a good Jesuit word, but engage in the formation of men and women. We help young people figure out, as Jack would say, help them figure out, discover their authentic selves. We don't just do that. We do that in the company of people who are engaged in knowledge creation, scholarship, and inquiry. And we also serve the public good. This point is not just that those are the three things that go on in universities, in the distinctive American university, but that they have everything to do with each other. So there are other institutions in our culture that engage in formation. the military, for example. But the kind of formation that goes on at universities is distinctive because it goes on where young people are in the company of people we'll call faculty who've spent their lives devoted to asking. And there are other institutions in our culture that engage in research and knowledge creation, pharmaceutical companies, for example, but they're not necessarily driven by the common good, public. So how we do knowledge creation is shaped by our drive for the common good, and how we do knowledge creation and serving the common good then in turn informs what it means that we form men and women. So he says it's the three interrelated critical things that universities do that make them universities, and those things can't be unbundled. So you can teach people stuff in other contexts, but what we do has to do with those three things being together. Now, one of my points that I'll come back to later is that even though universities do these three things in the same place, we don't always do them in a super integrated way. That might be one of our challenges for the next phase of our. But that's where we begin. This Irish joke that goes something like a person stops and says, somebody on the street and says, "I'm sorry, can you tell me how to get to such and such?" And the person says, "Well, to begin with, I wouldn't start from here." So this is where wherever we're going, this is where we start from. This is where we start. And it occurs to me that if you're asking the question, who's in control, and thinking about students as collaborators, creators, consumers of education, it has to be rooted in the idea that we do these three things in a deeply interrelated way. And many of the things in the opening video, speak directly. In fact, the opening video said everything I say. Feel free to multi. So in the class that I teach with this architect, Ann Pendleton-Julian, we tell our students that what they're designing for is not, when they're designing the University of 2030, they're not designing for content, they're designing for context. So we're asking them to at least think about and speculate what will the conditions of knowledge, technology, learning, et cetera, be like in 50 years, as best we can project. And then what kind of graduate would we want to produce? And there's a lot of ways to get at that. And I'm just going to offer you one or two. So one is the question that comes out of the work of Levy and Murnane, who are two economists. About a decade ago, they wrote the book, The New Division of Labor, and then most recently, this booklet, which is available on the internet, called Dancing with Robots, and I understand that the robot we saw in the video does dance, right? So, different kind of dancing with robots. So, apropos. And they're basically asking the question, what is it that humans do that machines can't? What is it that computers do that humans can't do as well? And then to project that and to basically ask the question, if we think forward 15 or 20 years, what work will be left human? At the pace of acceleration of computing technology and artificial intelligence, 15, 20 years, what work will be left? They say it comes down to this. Human labor market center on three kinds of work. This is what humans will be able to still be able to. Solving unstructured problems, working with new information, including complex communication. But computers are already very good at routine communication. I don't know if any of you recently have had like a heart-to-heart talk with digitized help desk at your local cable supplier or something like that. But they're pretty good. I was on the phone for like a half hour with one. And at the end of the conversation, or at the beginning of the conversation, I gave her my numbers, and she says, "Okay," she says, "Okay, I have your records in front of me." I thought, wait, you don't even have a front. You don't even have a me. You can't say that. But literally at the end, it was over, and I said, "Thank you." And I interrupted her asking me if I would stay on the line for a survey, but when I said thank you, she said, "You're welcome," interrupted herself and said, "You're welcome." Yeah, I was totally freaked out. And, like Joaquin Phoenix, a little bit in love. So working with new information and carrying out non-routine tasks. And they're saying these are the only things that humans will be doing. And there's some pretty scary predictions about the hollowing out of the middle class, et cetera. But everything else will be done by either extremely low-wage workers or robots. This is their prediction. So if we're educating people to do anything for 15 years or later in the future, these are the things they need to be really optimally educated. That's one way of thinking about the future. Another is to kind of look around at what's happening around us and try to project out what's that going to look like as that proliferates at the speed it's come out in the last few years. So here I have what I call my brief history of the past 3 years in higher education. And it goes like this. It was only fall of 2011 when Stanford University invented online learning. That's also a right? But if you remember, that was when Sebastian Thrun offered his artificial intelligence course online. There were 160,000 people who took it, et cetera. And after that, as I like to say, for about 15 minutes, MOOCs were cool. Then there was like a 2-year period when all colleges and universities went extinct, right? According to the New York Times, Time Magazine, Wall Street Journal, we all went out of business. There was no reason for us. All our dorms were condos. Well, actually, most of your dorms are condos, I guess, as I've heard. But then stuff started happening. San Jose State, certain experiments failed. We started learning that most of the people in MOOCs actually weren't people without college degrees, but other people, like 10% of people. So MOOCs then were not cool. Then MOOCs went extinct, and then everything was fine. And that is a brief history of higher education in the last 3 years. Pretty much it. So some of you may be familiar with the Gartner Group's hype cycle around technology, in which all technology is almost always overvalued in the short run and undervalued in the long run. Right? So it almost always, if you look on top, is there, something triggers it. Then there's what they call the peak of inflated expectations. That's when all the articles were coming out that everybody was going to now study online. No one was going to need to go to universities. Then they dip down to the trough of disillusionment. That's when everybody thought, oh, MOOCs are dead. That was fun. But then over a period of 8 to 10 years, whatever it was that people were excited about initially in the technology, whatever it was that was drawing hundreds of millions of dollars of venture capital into the space, those things start to work their way into our culture. And somebody wrote an article a year ago called A Very Slow Tsunami about how MOOCs follow that hype cycle perfectly. And so if you believe that, trust it, then it may not be MOOCs per se, but there's something about that was happening in the mania over the last few years that over the next 8 years or so is going to start to have a profound influence on higher education. So these are my 4 horsemen of disruption on higher education, starting from the upper corner. So on the one hand, you have this whole phenomenon of open online courses and et cetera. And really disruption isn't necessarily a negative word, because this is just all part of the environment that's going to be part of that slope that's going to change what we do. So have the open online courses and that whole explosion, edX, Coursera, et cetera. You also have this huge explosion of what I would call skills-based learning that's available on the web. Khan Academy, Code Academy, lynda.com, General Assembly, Udemy. The list just goes on and on of places on the web you can learn stuff, sometimes very high quality, very focused learning. Third, and this is really, to my mind, what brought all those hundreds of millions of dollars capital into the space, is believing in data analytics and the role that analytics-driven education can have in terms of both scaling, personalizing. So intelligent tutors, adaptive learning, recommendation engines, all the kinds of things that are changing healthcare that, the reason I wear this thing on my wrist, almost every other aspect of our lives that's being reshaped by data. The money was banking on the fact that data was going to change education. Data was going to break what's often called the iron triangle of access, quality, and cost. Be able to teach more people well, sustainable cost, pump technology. It wasn't really famous professors on video. It's the promise of how it could personalize learning. And then, of course, there's public pressure. How are we going to evaluate institutions, count graduation rates? Are we going to count starting income, pressure to educate more people, and of course, all the while public support of education. Those are the pressures on higher education. So at Georgetown, sitting in the Red House, doing this work, trying to imagine what would it look like to reinvent education, there's many assumptions, and I just distilled out 3 that I think are pertinent for today. One is, in 5 to 10 years, we'll be outcompeted on cost on anything that looks like just the delivery of content with this environment exploding. 2, credit hour connected to seat time will start to give way. And it just has to at some level, because there's going to be so many ways to learn stuff that doesn't have to be seat. And then there'll be an expansion of the kinds of degrees and certification that people can get, and eventually that find. So those are just 3 assumptions. So what does that mean for us in university, like yours and mine? To me, it means that by 2025, 2030, there will only really be 2 things that we can say universities do that the web doesn't. And it's those 2 things. What I would call mentored learning. By mentored learning, I mean that really broadly, not just one-on-one, not necessarily one-on-one at all, but mentored learning meaning learning that happens when you're in conditions of uncertainty and a person or people who know more about what to do than you do are near you, and you're getting continuous feedback on how to learn. That's mentored learning. It happened in a classroom, happened in the field, happened back in. There's a particular kind of learning that I would call mentored learning. And then the other is what I would call the arc of learning, which is that there is something about the journey of learning from somewhere to somewhere that's greater than the whole, greater than the sum of the parts. That it takes some time, that it's in a community that's more diverse than you've been used to, that it has challenges, that falling off the path and back onto it, or it has diversions scripted in, or whatever. But there's something about a particular kind of learning, mentored learning, and this arc. And other than that, people are going to be able to learn stuff in 100 or 1,000 different ways. Those are the 2 things that universities can do that nobody else can, or that universities can do better than. So the problem is, on the surface of it, that's the most expensive part of education, right? Unfortunately, the most cost-effective part of our model is downloading information. And if we're going to shed that and have to recenter ourselves around that kind of learning, then we have to figure out how do we do that sustainably. As we like to say at Georgetown, I like to say at Georgetown, we can hardly afford to be us today. How can we afford to be us in 2020? So that's why I think about how that the great tension that we're living out at this moment in our history is not between face-to-face and online learning. It's not between profits and nonprofits, not between residential learning and scaled learning. It's between integration and disintegration. Vision of learning that either learn things that are competency-based, very granular, very focused, or a vision of learning where the whole equals greater than the sum of the. I think we need both, but universities have to figure out how to harness stuff over there, service of making this our hallmark. So, a few years ago, I wrote an article called Disrupting Ourselves, which I started with a line that our understanding of learning has expanded at a rate that's far outpaced our conceptions of it. And I think if we're going to focus ourselves more and more around mentored learning, then we have to try to imagine how we can rethink some of our structures to optimize for that. So this is what I mean by that we've kind of outpaced ourselves. Try to move through this quickly. So many of you may be familiar with this list. This is a list of what are known as high-impact practices. Right? These are the practices that have been dubbed high-impact practices out of millions of data points from the National Survey of Student Engagement, because these are the practices that students who engage in these practices are more likely to graduate at higher rates with higher achievement, that these practices are more highly correlated with deeper learning, according to the National Survey of Student Engagement. But it's a huge data set. So you can see the kinds of things many of you may be engaged in these practices. First-year experiences, intensive writing, undergraduate research, the kinds of things you saw in the video. Same list, I'm now mapping this across the curriculum. So when I look out at the curriculum as Vice Provost of Education, one way to look at it is that you've got the formal curriculum sitting in the center of the university, and this, what I would call the experiential co-curriculum around the margin. Undergraduate research, study abroad, internships, community-based learning, other things like that. Not just the whole extra curriculum, but the most learning-intensive parts of the co-curriculum. That outer ring has gone from almost nowhere to a huge part of our campuses in the last 30 or 40. But it's still generally marginal. We spend most of our dollars in the center on the formal undergraduate curriculum. And yet, I don't know about here, but at a place like Georgetown, we invest a lot of our mission and brand in the outer ring. So if you go to Georgetown's website and look at the videos, which I don't really believe that anybody goes to college websites and watches the videos, but let's pretend people actually watch the videos that universities put on their website. Most of them are about the margin. Most of them are out there. So the question is, what makes high-impact practices high impact? Like, what is it about, what kind of learning is happening there? And a lot of people have invested a lot of time in this, and so I'm combining a bunch of different sources. But here's what we think why students value them so highly and why they have such high impact. And incidentally, the data on their impact goes up with underrepresented minorities, first-generation students, and at-risk students. So the effects are even greater on students who are least likely to succeed. So there are places where students invest time on task, where they engage in what Lee Schulman, used to be the president of the Carnegie Foundation, would call accountable talk, accountable thinking, give and get meaningful feedback, make daily decisions in uncertainty. There are places where students get taken out of their comfort zones, and it's a place where people have the opportunity to integrate, synthesize. That's what we think makes these so valuable. This is what I would call part of the new ecology of learning. And it's interesting if you compare that list, which comes completely out of universities, studying what it is that we think that why students think high impact practices have high impact. That list looks almost identical to a bunch of work that's been done by a lot of people, but people are now galvanizing around this term of connected learning. Large research report that Mimi Ito and a bunch of her colleagues, who are all anthropologists, who have been studying youth in the United States and Japan, who mostly spend a lot of time on the web and doing other web-related, community-related projects outside of school. For them, connected learning is when young people pursue personal interests with the support of friends and caring adults. They're able to link it to something that matters to them. Connected learning is interest-driven, unscripted, peer-supported. It's focused on producing stuff, Students have or the youth have a shared sense of purpose, and most of this happens on the web, so it's openly networked. So to me, it's really interesting that inside the universities, the data we have on the practices that seem to have the biggest effect on student success have many of the qualities of learning of often disaffected youth outside of school who are highly engaged in web-based learning environments. A very different way to think of the digital world than MOOCs, automated learning, et cetera. This, to me, is the new ecology of thinking about those two things together. So, if you're looking at this and then asking, well, if these are the things that make learning matter most, and if we have this huge center, we're investing all our money and all these, because if you look at where these high impact practices are located, sorry, I didn't say this, half of them are in the co-curriculum, and the other half are anomalous in the formal curriculum. That one first-year seminar, that one or two writing intensive course, that occasional, though here getting less and less occasional, course where you're doing team-based collaborative learning. So what do you do about this? Well, one thing is you just try to make courses more like high-impact practices. All the wonderful things, for example, going on in your tile classrooms, that's a really good example. Someone who ran a Center for Teaching and Learning for 13 years, that's what we did. Tried to work with faculty to make their classes more like high-impact. That's a really good way to respond to this, like on Monday, like right now. But I want to think about, like, what does this mean going forward in the future? 10 more minutes. I promise I'll be. This is what I think of as the recentered curriculum. So these are my circles. You'll recognize these circles from a previous slide. Copied and pasted, unadulterated, reshaped. But now I'm trying to think about what happens in the overlap of the highest impact parts of the formal curriculum and the most learning intensive parts of co-curriculum. So what I think is going to happen, based on the external forces that I've been talking about, is that increasingly certain parts of the formal curriculum are to be drawn out of the university. So the two rectangles you see, rectangle on that end is what I think of as the part of the formal curriculum that's generic and interchangeable. So if nothing else, one of the things that the whole MOOC, rise and fall of MOOCs of the last 3 years demonstrated to us was it exposed the formal and generic parts of the formal curriculum as generic and interchangeable. Many introduction to statistics courses were taught in the United States last fall. How many introduction to anything? That doesn't mean you don't have a great one here or a bunch of great ones here or that you don't teach a great one. It just means that more or less the same thing was happening in a lot of courses all over the country. On the other side, on the right-hand side, this rectangle is the part of every university that I would consider irreducibly local. It's the opposite of generic and interchangeable. It's the part that makes you, you. For us, Georgetown, it's us being in DC, being Jesuit and Catholic, being international, it's being residential. But you would have your own list. So, what I'm suggesting is that increasingly the generic and interchangeable parts are going to be pulled out of the university. And it's going to force us to recenter ourselves around this high impact center, which in some cases could mean teaching a very high impact, blended, very locally unique version of introduction to something. Doesn't mean everybody's coming to us as sophomores, but it puts pressure on us to say, why would somebody come here to do something they could find 100 of on the internet? Because it's in the center, this high impact integrative center, I think, is what's left to us that's distinctive to university. That's where you develop people who will become ethical human beings. That's where you develop practitioners, dentists, engineers, doctors, teachers. I don't think you can do some of that online. You can't do it all online. Where you create whole people in that center. That's where I think we have to invest our brand and identity. I think rhetorically, at a matter of rhetoric rocks. We're in a rhetoric rocks. So I'm sorry if I'm insulting the term rhetoric by saying it as a matter of rhetoric. We all believe in that center, but I don't believe most of our institutions are designed around it. I don't think that's where we're investing most of our money. I don't think that's where our designs begin. But the question, if we were inventing the university now, what would we do? I think we'd start. Because we'd ask, what is it that's unique about what we can do here? This community, these things we do uniquely, density of people we have. What do we do uniquely here that isn't happening in the rest of the learning ecosystem, of which the university no longer has a monopoly? So there's at least 3 things that happen in this center, right? This is a place where you teach people to deal with unstructured, complex problems. Because that's what you all do as scholars. Do authentic work, interdisciplinary inquiry, social learning. So it's a place for working on unstructured problems. But it also can be a place of what I would call reflection and sense-making. How do you take all the fragments of your learning and weave them into a whole? Not talking about portfolios in this presentation, but to me that's one of the things that learning portfolios are especially. And it's also a space for what Marcia Baxter Magolda famously dubbed self-authorship, where students learn how to be, and both by moving internal to themselves, but also learning how to care about other people. To me, all those things happen in that center. So this is the big question. How do you design for that center? Thank you. Oh, sadly, I have a little bit more. Are you coming up to give me the hook? I'm not done, actually. Okay. But I'll try to be super quick. But I do have a couple. I just want to show you 2 or 3 concrete examples of things we're doing at Georgetown, and then a brief emotional ending, and then I'll stop again. So some of the things that we're trying to do, there's so many things to talk about, and I gnashed over many of them, but I'll just throw out one is that we first step back and we ask, what is it that we most value, right? This kind of came out of the Obama administration briefly floating that they wanted to evaluate institutions based on graduation rates and starting income. And we thought, well, we don't think that's really who we are. We don't really think that's how we want to be evaluated. So we said, well, if we think we should be evaluated on other terms, then we better step up and start seeing if we can measure them. So one of the first things we did was step back, said, what are the most important things, what are the biggest outcomes we think we're striving for? We created this thing we call the Magis measures. Magis is a Latin term, which means the more and always trying to give more, do more, be more. It's a very important word to the Jesuits. So anyway, we call these the Magis measures, and these are the 5 things that we said we're going to try to think about. What does it look like if you actually start doing designs around this thing? We said this is what we'd be pretty happy with, right? Intersecting with knowledge, skills, abilities, right? You need people to know how to do stuff. You can't develop these absent of. Nobody didn't believe in these things, but what if we actually design and measure them? Actually, for our incoming class last fall, for the first time, we actually administered an incoming survey / psychometric instrument trying to start to measure some of it. But now we're about to start a project where we're working with faculty to say who thinks they're doing even one of these things on purpose in the context of their learning design. And then we'll take the next step to say, well, what would it look like to actually build some of this into a rubric or into assignment? So that was just one outcome. That's a broad kind of meta level. Let me give you examples of 2 pilots out of many that we're launching. One is called a studio collaborative. We're actually piloting this right now in the spring. And it started with the idea that we would take 3 self-standing courses and bring them together under a single umbrella. So we didn't have to mess around with the team teaching budgeting issues. We just would take 3 courses and bring together an event. In this case, we have Intro to Bioethics, a course called Shaping National Science Policy. It's an interdisciplinary science and policy course, and an Introduction to Rhetoric, a big day for rhetoric. So the 3 of them together kind of bring together the notion of, you have civic-mindedness, ethics, values, how do you think about acting civically, and then communication, how do you be effective. So those 3 courses are brought together under a single umbrella, but it's not just as a theme. At the center of them sits something that we're trying to develop as a concept, which is the idea of a studio. Right? And of course, it draws from other studios, from the arts, et cetera. But this here is really also drawn from kind of the world of design thinking, human-centered design, incubation labs, et cetera. The idea is to create a mentored, open space where students, as someone involved in the project puts it, learn to create and create to learn. But it sits at the center. So the students in these 3 courses are interacting through this open studio space on actual projects. And each of these collaboratives will then engage external partners working on authentic projects. In the fall version we ran, they worked with 2. National Geographic on the ethics of genetic testing, and a pharmaceutical firm that's trying to develop a drug to treat eclampsia, which is an affliction for pregnant women. So the ethics of doing medical testing on pregnant women is very complex, but the only way you can test a drug for pregnant women is on pregnant women. So these students were actually involved in doing design thinking work on how to think about the ethics and communicate the ethics around testing on pregnant women. And then at some point in the semester, the students are put in cross-course teams to work on actual authentic projects. So it'll be 2 ethics students, 2 science and policy students, 2 rhetoric students, each joining the team, bringing their expertise from their respective. Purpose-driven, openly networked, but working within the structures that are already in place. Freestanding courses, separately taught. In this case, all these courses are offered at different times. Students can go attend the other courses anytime they want. Different model is what we're calling the DC Urban Cluster. In this case, we have 4 courses, all focused on urban issues, that are all offered in the exact same time slot, each from different disciplines. The faculty design 1 7-week module and then plan to teach it twice with interaction among them. And around week 5 or 6, students in every section will decide which other section they want to jump to, that they want to now get a historical view or an entrepreneurship view or whatever of these urban issues. In this case, there's a studio called the DC Studio that sits outside or next to this project, and this is explicitly for more advanced students who want to continue their community-based work. We had all these faculty who were doing interesting community-based work in their classes. Then they were telling us, some of my students want to keep going, and I have no credit-bearing context for them to keep. So we're creating a studio to allow students to continue the rhythm of the things that become their passions for credit, and to figure out how to recognize some of the mentoring for faculty as part of their load. So conventionally, students would do it on their backs and faculty would do it on their backs. This is built into the business model. But then to tie those explicitly to the university's research theme, the university's big engagement, and then eventually to tie some of those back. So those are just 2 examples of what, to me, it seems like the next thing we could be thinking about in terms of trying to design for the high impact center. And it's not a big revolutionary, let's change the whole university. It's really, what happens if we introduce the concept of studio? Or what happens if we introduce the concept of credit-bearing ongoing research to nurture certain students' rhythms of their passion? Take another step. What would happen if we actually shifted some of the seat time for some of those students in some majors where they could actually get project-based credit awarded through portfolio assessment. Just trying what it would look like to move toward that center. And both of these, to me, also start to come out of this idea that President DeGioia suggested, kind of push his 3 elements. What would it really look like to design curriculum in a more integrated way for a university who thought those were the 3 distinctive things that it would it look like to bring formation, knowledge creation, serving the common good together, even at the very heart of the lower division curriculum? What would it look like to create curriculum for which we might believe were the only 2 things we could do distinct to the rest of the learning? So there is an old saying about the 19th century, that in the 19th century, the railroads that thought they were in the railroad business mostly went out of it. But the railroads that understood that they were in the transportation business mostly survived. So I think the challenge for us is to figure out what is our version of the transportation business. We're not in the 120 credit business. We're not in the certain number of courses business. We're in something like that: formation, integration, transformation. I think we have to figure out what it means to really redesign the university to be in that business if we want to be relevant in 2025. And we don't know exactly what's going to happen, and it may happen much slower than we predict. But it seems to me that if we think we're in the information business, knowledge transfer business, or the low-level skills business, then at the very least, by 2030, we're going to have a lot of competition. Thank you. Now I'm